Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you heartfelt and inspiring tales that touch the soul. Today, we have a remarkable journey to share with you, a story of love, sacrifice, and the unexpected twists life throws our way. Meet Sarah, a woman who, in a desperate bid to save her mother's life, enters into a marriage of convenience with Ethan, a disabled millionaire battling family betrayal. What begins as a contract soon transforms into something deeper, as they find themselves bound not only by obligation but by genuine care and respect. Stay with us to witness this emotional journey unfold. Be sure to subscribe to Life Stories and begin the adventure today. It was an ordinary Tuesday, but it felt as though everything in my life was teetering on the edge of something far less ordinary. My mother had been in the hospital for a week now, unconscious and hanging between life and death. The sterile smell of disinfectant in the hallways was suffocating, a constant reminder of how fragile her situation was. The doctors had said that the surgery she needed was urgent, she wouldn't survive much longer without it. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach every time they spoke those words. I had tried everything to get the money. Every option had run out. Friends, family, even distant relatives had all closed their doors, unwilling or unable to help. I had taken out loans, but the banks had stopped approving anything more. Every day, I watched my mother's condition worsen, helpless to do anything about it. It felt as though the universe had forgotten about me. And as night began to fall over the city, leaving the sky a bruised purple outside the windows, I stood in that hospital corridor, feeling utterly alone. Then, the phone call came. The voice on the other end was calm, almost unnervingly so, considering the gravity of the situation. Miss Collins, my name is Charles Allen. I'm an attorney representing Mr. Ethan Knight. He has asked me to contact you regarding an arrangement that may solve your financial difficulties. I gripped the phone tighter, trying to steady my breath. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. The words, arrangement, and financial difficulties, were a blur in my mind as the world around me spun faster than I could process. Mr. Knight, the voice continued, is offering you assistance, but there are conditions. He would like to meet you in person to discuss the possibility of marriage. I must have laughed in disbelief, at least. That's how it felt to me, though I'm sure I didn't make any noise. A marriage? To a man I had never met? The absurdity of the idea was like a slap in the face. I don't even know him, I stammered, glancing down at my shoes as if they would provide some answers. Mr. Knight has been informed of your situation, Charles replied with a tone that suggested he had already heard every possible reaction. He is willing to cover your mother's hospital expenses, including the surgery, if you choose to accept his offer. But he requests that you meet with him first. I swallowed hard. It was the offer I had been waiting for. But something about it felt so strange. A complete stranger wanting to marry me for the sake of helping my mother? Was it some sort of cruel joke? But my mother's life hung in the balance, and I couldn't let doubt cloud my judgment. Can you tell me more about Mr. Knight? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Charles hesitated. Mr. Knight is a man with certain physical limitations, he said cautiously. He was involved in an accident years ago. The specifics are best left for him to explain personally. My chest tightened with the mention of his physical condition. For a moment, I felt a flicker of relief. Perhaps he simply wanted companionship. And in exchange, he was offering the financial support I so desperately needed. Still, the whole thing felt too unreal, as though someone were playing a game with me. But my mother's condition, her shallow breathing, the constant beeping of the monitors, was a reality I couldn't ignore. All right, I said, my voice cracking as the weight of it all hit me. I'll meet him. Charles instructed me to meet Mr. Knight the next day at a cafe. My mind was spinning with 1,000 thoughts as I hung up the phone. Was I making the right decision? Was this a foolish gamble? But in the end, I had no choice. My mother's life depended on it. The next afternoon, I found myself walking into a quiet, upscale cafe in a part of the city I had never ventured to before. The polished tables and the scent of fresh brewed coffee seemed alien to me. I had never been in a place like this. Nor could I have ever afforded to. My heart hammered in my chest as I scanned the room, searching for the person I was supposed to meet. A neatly dressed man with salt and pepper hair spotted me and gave me a small wave. I recognized him from the business card, Charles Allen. Beside him sat a man in a wheelchair, his dark hair neatly combed and a thin blanket covering his legs. His face was lean, and his eyes, though warm and intelligent, held a depth of emotion I couldn't quite place. "Miss Collins," the man in the wheelchair said softly, his voice carrying a slight tremor. "Thank you for coming." I took his hand, though my thoughts were a whirlwind. "Thank you for agreeing to help my mother. If this is really what you intend to do." Ethan nodded slightly, his expression serious but not unkind. "I understand this may seem strange, but I promise you I mean no harm. I simply need a wife. At least on paper, to strengthen my position within my family's affairs. And in return, I can help you." A wife? A stranger offering help for the sake of a contract? Everything about this situation felt like a story ripped from the pages of a fairy tale. Only it was anything but magical. "Why marriage?" I asked, my voice shaking despite myself. Ethan's gaze shifted, and I caught a flicker of pain in his eyes. "Because," he began, his voice quieter now, "I can't trust the people around me. My family, especially my uncle. I need someone who has no personal stake in my business. Someone who genuinely needs help, but isn't motivated by greed. I want this to be an arrangement that benefits us both." With respect, I listened, my heart still heavy with doubt, but also beginning to feel a strange sympathy for this man. How lonely he must be, I thought, to feel the need to hire a wife just to navigate his family's treacherous waters. Still, I was torn. The stakes were high for me. My mother's life hung in the balance, and the enormity of what I was being asked to consider was staggering. He continued, speaking about his family's business, how his uncle had wrongfully imprisoned his parents and how Ethan, disabled from a car accident, was now fighting to regain control of his inheritance. It wasn't just the financial support that I needed, it was someone to trust. Someone to share my burden with. As much as I had my doubts, I also knew that this could be the only chance I had to save my mother. I nodded slowly. "All right, I'll agree to your terms, but only if you promise that you'll be honest with me. I need to know everything about your family and your condition. I can't do this if I'm kept in the dark." Ethan's lips twitched in what almost seemed like a smile, tinged with sadness. "I promise," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You'll know everything." The next day, my heart pounded in my chest as I walked into Ethan's world. It felt surreal. I had signed the contract, agreed to the marriage, and now my life was on an entirely different course. It was hard to believe how quickly everything had changed. In just a few short hours, Ethan's lawyer had transferred the money into my mother's account, and the hospital had prepped her for surgery. The relief that flooded me was overwhelming. My mother was going to survive. But the cost was steep, far higher than I could have ever imagined. Ethan's mansion loomed before me, its towering gates opening slowly as I approached. It was a world so different from the one I had known. I had spent most of my life in modest surroundings, scraping by just to make ends meet. This place was like something out of a dream, gleaming stone and tall windows, manicured lawns that seemed to stretch endlessly. I felt small, out of place. The air was thick with the kind of wealth I had never encountered. And the heavy iron gates closing behind me felt symbolic. Once I entered, there was no going back. A housekeeper, dressed in a pristine uniform, greeted me with a polite smile. "Welcome, Miss Collins. Mr. Knight is expecting you." I nodded, trying to quell the storm of anxiety in my chest. I was led through the grand foyer, with its marble floors and a staircase that looked like it belonged in a palace. The decor was elegant, tasteful art, soft furnishings, everything spotless. I felt self-conscious in my simple clothes, my hand-me-down coat hanging loosely on my shoulders. I had never felt so out of place. But I reminded myself that I wasn't here to enjoy the luxury. I was here because my mother's life depended on it. Ethan was waiting for me in a large, airy living room, his wheelchair positioned near the window, the light filtering in and casting shadows across the room. He looked up as I entered, and there was a kind smile on his face, though it was tinged with something I couldn't quite read. "You made it," he said softly, his voice warm but guarded. "How's your mother?" he asked, his gaze lingering on me with genuine concern. "She's stable," I replied, my voice shaking a little. "The surgery went well, but she's still not out of danger. The doctors said she'll need weeks, maybe months of rehab." "That's good news," Ethan said, nodding slowly. "I'm glad to hear she's doing better." His words were sincere, and I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of gratitude toward him. It was a strange feeling, knowing that a man I barely knew had saved my mother's life. I was starting to see him differently, though there was more to Ethan than I had first realized. "Please, make yourself comfortable," Ethan continued, motioning to the sofa across from him. "I realize this situation is far from ordinary, but I want you to feel at home here. I know it's not easy, but I'm doing my best to help." I hesitated but then took a seat, the cushion sinking beneath me. For a moment, there was an awkward silence between us. Neither of us seemed to know quite what to say. Our arrangement had begun to take shape, but the reality of it, living together under such unusual circumstances, was something neither of us had anticipated. "Is this home overwhelming?" Ethan asked, his voice breaking the silence. "I understand it might feel strange, but I want you to know, you're free to come and go as you please. You're not a prisoner here." I smiled weakly, trying to shake off the feeling of being an intruder in his world. "I'm not used to this kind of life," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I never imagined something like this would happen, but I won't forget what you've done for me." Ethan's expression softened, and for the first time, I noticed a faint trace of vulnerability in his eyes. Despite his wealth, despite his position, there was something deeply human in him, something I hadn't expected. "I didn't do it for recognition," he said, his voice quiet. "I did it because I wanted to help. And because, well, because I couldn't stand the thought of you losing your mother." I looked at him, a knot forming in my throat. Ethan had given me more than just money. He had given me hope when I had none left to offer. And in doing so, he had started to make a place for himself in my heart. Over the next few days, I settled into a strange rhythm. I spent my mornings at the hospital, visiting my mother, making sure she had everything she needed as she began her recovery. The rest of the day, I would return to the mansion, where I spent time with Ethan. His life was far from easy. There were endless meetings, phone calls, and paperwork related to his family's business. But in the moments when the world seemed to quiet, he was kind, always asking how I was doing, always making sure I was comfortable. I began to notice the little things. How Ethan would brace himself before every step. How his face would tighten in pain whenever he moved too quickly. And how he always seemed to mask his discomfort behind a mask of politeness. There was a fragility to him that he tried to hide, but it was impossible to ignore. Despite his struggle, Ethan never once complained. Instead, he threw himself into his work, determined to right the wrongs his uncle had done to him and his family. As much as I tried to ignore it, I couldn't help but notice the way his eyes would light up when he spoke about his parents. How much he longed for the day when he could prove their innocence and restore their legacy. I had only agreed to marry him to help my mother. But as time passed, something unexpected began to happen. I found myself caring for him in ways I couldn't explain. And the more I saw of the man beneath the wheelchair, the more I realized how deeply misunderstood he was. Ethan Knight was not just a wealthy man in need of a wife. He was someone who, in his own way, had become a victim of his circumstances. A man who had been robbed of everything he once held dear. As the days passed, I became more accustomed to my new life. The mansion, once intimidating, began to feel more like a place where I could breathe, where I could find moments of calm amidst the chaos of my mother's recovery and Ethan's complicated family drama. There were mornings when I would sit with him, having tea, and watch the sunlight filter through the large windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors. In those quiet moments, It was easy to forget that our relationship was born from necessity. But there were also moments when reality crept back in, when Ethan would close himself off behind the walls he had built so carefully around his heart. I would see flashes of his vulnerability, a moment of discomfort that he quickly hid, or the haunted look in his eyes when he mentioned his family's troubles. It was clear that Ethan's battle wasn't just with his uncle or the business empire. It was with the loss of everything he had once known. His parents, his legacy, his health, everything was at risk. And I, the woman who had entered his life so unexpectedly, was now part of that fragile world. The wedding was approaching fast. Ethan insisted on keeping things small, just a handful of family and business associates. His uncle, Richard Knight, would be there, of course, along with his wife, Miranda. Their presence loomed like a storm cloud hanging over everything. Ethan's lawyer, Charles Allen, took care of the legal details, ensuring that the marriage would appear legitimate in the eyes of the family and the board. I spent the days leading up to the wedding trying to prepare myself, even though a part of me still couldn't quite believe that this was happening. How had I gone from fighting for my mother's life in a sterile hospital room to preparing for a wedding under such strange circumstances? It didn't seem real, but as the day drew nearer, the reality began to set in. On the morning of the wedding, I found myself standing in front of a mirror, staring at the woman I had become. I wore a simple yet elegant ivory gown, a gift from Ethan. My hair was done in soft waves, and the makeup was subtle, just enough to highlight the quiet beauty I had spent years hiding. I barely recognized the woman in the reflection. My mind kept drifting back to my mother, still in the hospital, recovering from her surgery. She was going to be okay. But I couldn't help but feel torn. She would never understand this decision. But she was alive, and for that, I had to be grateful. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Charles, Ethan's lawyer, stepped inside, his face lighting up with admiration when he saw me. "You look beautiful, Miss Collins," he said with a smile. "Thank you," I replied softly, adjusting the gown as though it might offer me some semblance of comfort. "Mr. Knight is waiting at the altar," Charles continued, his voice calm but with a note of quiet excitement. "The ceremony will begin shortly." I nodded, my heart hammering in my chest. As I stepped out into the garden, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The guests were already gathering, most of them quietly whispering amongst themselves. Uncle Richard and Miranda stood off to the side, their expressions tight, almost mocking. Ethan was at the front, his wheelchair facing the small altar they had set up in the center of the garden. He looked calm, too calm, and yet there was a tension in his eyes that spoke volumes. As I walked down the aisle, I tried not to focus on the skeptical gazes of the few distant relatives and business associates who had gathered. They would never understand the true nature of our relationship, and I wasn't sure I wanted them to. This was not a wedding for them, it was a marriage built on necessity. On survival, on doing whatever it took to protect those we loved. And yet, as I reached Ethan's side, I couldn't help but feel a small glimmer of something else, something deeper. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was respect, it was care, it was a bond that had been forged in fire, tested by hardship, and tempered by the trials we had both faced. The officiant raised his arms, welcoming everyone, and we exchanged our vows. I promised to stand by Ethan's side, to honor him in sickness and in health, just as he promised to care for me. The words seemed almost too grand for what we were experiencing, a marriage born out of practicality. Yes, but also of understanding. As I looked into Ethan's eyes, I knew that he wasn't just fulfilling an obligation. He was making a promise. One that wasn't just for show. But then, just as the ceremony reached its climax, a sharp voice interrupted the silence. "I object." The tension in the garden was palpable as all eyes turned toward Ethan's uncle, Richard, his face twisted with smug satisfaction. "This wedding is a sham," he sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. "My nephew has been lying about his condition for years. And this woman, this opportunist, has no intention of staying married to him once she's had her fill of his money." The shock rippled through the crowd. But it was Ethan's reaction that stunned me. He didn't flinch. He didn't retreat. Instead, he lifted his chin, his jaw tightening. "I'm not weak, Uncle," Ethan said, his voice calm but laced with barely contained fury. "And this marriage isn't a sham. I've never lied to gain sympathy. I kept my progress hidden because of you. Because you want me to be weak. So you can take everything from me." I stood there, watching as the confrontation unfolded. Richard's smug expression faltered for a moment. But he quickly regained his composure. The crowd was silent, waiting for the next move. Ethan continued, his voice unwavering. "I can stand. And I can walk. Though it's not easy. But you, Uncle, have been manipulating the truth for years. You framed my parents to take control of this family. You want to keep me under your thumb so you can steal everything from me." The shock in the crowd was palpable. Ethan's uncle, realizing he had lost control of the situation, stepped back, his face flushed with anger. "You'll never get away with this, Ethan," Richard spat, before turning and storming off, Miranda trailing behind him. In that moment, the tension melted away, and something unexpected happened. Ethan, no longer bound by his wheelchair, stood tall, his eyes meeting mine with a vulnerability I had never seen before. He didn't need to say anything. I knew what this moment meant for him. It was the beginning of reclaiming not just his legacy, but his life. "Thank you," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "for standing by me." I nodded, my throat tight with unspoken words. We had come through this together. And in the midst of everything, I realized that there was something real between us, something worth fighting for. As the reception continued in the garden, the air was filled with a mix of tension and relief. Ethan and I stood side by side, our hands clasped together, silently acknowledging the momentous shift in our lives. The battle with his uncle wasn't over. But for the first time, Ethan had shown the strength I had always known he had. It wasn't just about physical recovery, it was about reclaiming his power, his dignity, and his place in the world. Looking at him, I realized how far we had come. From the hospital corridors to this grand estate. From a marriage of necessity to a partnership grounded in trust and understanding. What had started as a desperate arrangement had evolved into something deeper. Something genuine. I could see it in Ethan's eyes. And I felt it in my heart. He had given me hope when I thought there was none left. And now, we were standing together, no longer just two people bound by a contract. But two people who had found something real. Something worth protecting. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the garden, I knew that no matter what the future held, we would face it together. And in that moment, I felt a peace that had eluded me for so long. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey where Ethan and I found love, strength, and hope amidst a storm of family betrayal and hardship. We hope our story has inspired you to believe in the power of resilience, honesty, and heartfelt devotion. If you'd like to explore more stories that touch your heart and inspire your spirit, be sure to subscribe to the Life Stories channel and stay tuned for our next narrative packed with emotion and hope. Thank you for your support. And until next time, may love and bravery guide your path.